The glittering halls of Buckingham Palace turned into a scene no one expected. The Emir of Qatar, a man known for power and unshakable resolve, broke into tears as his guarded heart melted before Princess Catherine. One banquet, one gesture, and a kingdom watched history unfold in silence. The banquet that became a turning point. Buckingham Palace was glowing under the chandeliers, but this was no ordinary night. The state banquet had turned into a battlefield of quiet diplomacy. The Emir of Qatar had arrived not as a guest, but as a man with sharp demands, ready to push his leverage over Britain's energy and trade. Aides whispered of his firm stance, his unshakable will, and his reputation for getting exactly what he wanted. But then, the doors opened. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped into the Grand Hall. After months of health struggles, this was her first public appearance of real weight. Her presence was magnetic, a vision in emerald, her walk slow yet graceful, her smile calm but commanding. It wasn't just her beauty, it was the quiet strength in her eyes. She had chosen this night carefully, and as she entered, it was as if the room reset itself around her. The Emir's eyes followed her. For a moment, the man known for his cold strategy looked unsettled, almost vulnerable. Diplomats noticed the shift instantly. The ice in his body language cracked. What began as a banquet for political maneuvering was already turning into something else. Something no one had planned. Later, a palace aide whispered, "It was the second she walked in. Everything changed." And so, the banquet that was meant to be about deals and documents became something far more human. The stage was set, and Catherine was at the center, which leads directly to her return, not just to royal duty, but to her hidden power. Catherine's silent storm, a return like no other. Catherine's return wasn't casual. Every move was deliberate. She knew the world was watching, but her focus was far deeper, on connecting, on showing respect, and on reminding the world that real diplomacy doesn't always happen on paper. Her gown shimmered with subtle desert-inspired motifs, a nod to the culture she was honoring. She greeted guests in Arabic with flawless pronunciation, a gesture that stunned many in the hall. These weren't small choices, they were signs of preparation, care, and understanding. As one Middle Eastern guest said later, "She didn't just dress for us, she spoke to us." But her greatest power that night wasn't what she wore or said. It was her presence. Catherine radiated warmth without force, and the Emir couldn't look away. For months, palace staff had prepared speeches, strategies, and backup plans, but none of that mattered anymore. The moment Catherine smiled across the table, the hardest man in the room began to soften. She wasn't performing for cameras. She wasn't trying to steal the spotlight. She was simply herself, calm, dignified, resilient. And that was what struck the Emir hardest. He had entered the palace with a list of ultimatums. But now, across from him sat a woman who had weathered her own battles and returned with grace. Catherine's silent storm was more powerful than any negotiation tool. As one aide put it, "We thought the banquet was about business. She showed us it was about people." And from that moment, the night shifted. What began as icy politics was slowly melting into connection. The Emir's ice-cold demands. Before the banquet even began, palace aides were tense. The Emir of Qatar had come with a heavy list of demands, and his team made sure no one forgot it. Energy contracts, infrastructure projects, control over vital investments. Everything was written in firm terms, and nothing suggested compromise. "He's not here for pleasantries," one senior advisor admitted. "He's here to push." The atmosphere at the start of the evening reflected his posture. Arms crossed, voice clipped, and eyes scanning the room like a chessboard. He spoke in calculated tones, turning conversations back to business whenever possible. For those who had spent weeks preparing, this was exactly the moment they feared. A night where smiles covered an undercurrent of pressure. But then something unexpected unfolded. Catherine, sitting just across the hall, wasn't following a script. She didn't try to engage the emir with negotiations or counter-arguments. Instead, she focused on connection, on listening. She leaned in when others spoke, nodded when stories were shared, and her calm presence carried across the table. The turning point came when she was speaking with Shaker Jawaha, a guest who shared stories about her children. Catherine's instinctive response wasn't political. It was human. She reached out, gently touching her hand in genuine warmth. The gesture broke through the layers of protocol like glass shattering. At that exact moment, the emir's gaze shifted. He watched Catherine's sincerity, and something in him changed. The hall grew quiet, as if everyone present sensed the shift. Catherine then met his eyes, her look filled with empathy and understanding. No words, just a bridge of feeling. A hush fell. Even aides stopped scribbling in their notebooks. Diplomacy had just transformed in real time, not through documents or arguments, but through one unplanned gesture. The emir smiled, and it wasn't the polished smile of diplomacy. It was real, soft, human. For the first time that night, the man who came to pressure Britain showed his vulnerability. And that single moment cracked open what politics alone never could. Which takes us into the next stage of the evening. The moment the emir himself broke, and for the first time, praised Catherine in front of the entire hall. The one gesture that shattered protocol. By the time dessert was served, the emir's entire tone had shifted. Hours earlier, he had been unmovable, pressing on with strict points. But now, he leaned forward, his words directed less to policy and more to Catherine herself. Witnesses described his voice as softer, his manner less guarded. He wasn't speaking to the princess of protocol, one diplomat recalled. He was speaking to the woman who had touched his heart. The emir praised her directly, her grace, her strength, her resilience through personal challenges. He raised his glass, but it wasn't a toast to trade or treaties. It was to Catherine, honoring her as a woman who carried both dignity and warmth. The atmosphere in the hall transformed. Where aides had braced for confrontation, they now saw the most difficult negotiations fading quietly into the background. One official later admitted, "We came in preparing for war. We left celebrating peace." The emir, who was expected to press Britain into tight corners, was suddenly speaking as a guest who had been moved, even disarmed. Catherine hadn't argued, hadn't debated, hadn't even spoken of politics. She had simply shown humanity, in a room where humanity rarely had space. That's what broke through. Even King Charles and William, who had prepared themselves for hours of tense discussion, watched in disbelief. William's eyes never left Catherine. Each time she spoke, his pride was evident in the smallest of gestures, a nod, a smile. He later told aides she was the crown's calm in chaos. For the emir, this was not just admiration. It was recognition. He saw in Catherine something he once admired in Diana, a woman whose compassion spoke louder than any throne. And that realization struck deeply, bridging a divide that politics alone could never close. As the night closed, the emir wasn't the man who had arrived at Buckingham with iron walls. He was a guest softened, touched, and reshaped by one gesture that broke every barrier. And with that, history turned quietly, because Catherine's heart had just altered the course of a kingdom's negotiation. The moment the emir broke and praised her publicly. As the golden plates were cleared and the final course arrived, the room's energy had shifted beyond recognition. The emir of Qatar, once rigid and guarded, leaned closer, his posture softer, his voice lighter. For the first time that night, he wasn't discussing pipelines or contracts. He was speaking to Catherine directly. Witnesses recalled how his words surprised even his closest aides. He praised her as though she were royalty beyond titles, one official whispered afterward. The emir spoke not of trade or influence, but of her resilience. Her quiet grace, her courage in returning to duty after her personal battles. He called her a woman of heart and strength, and his words rang through the grand hall like music. Then came the moment that froze the palace in awe. He raised his glass high, not to policy, not to political gain, but to Catherine herself. "To the Princess of Wales," he said, his tone reverent, "for showing us that true power is the power of dignity." It was a scene no one could have scripted. Aides who had feared a bruising night of hard bargaining found themselves silently celebrating. The emir's once unyielding list of demands was now an afterthought, his tone transformed from pressure to admiration. The banquet that had begun as a battlefield was ending as a tribute. Even King Charles seemed moved, his face softening as he watched Catherine take in the words with quiet modesty. William's eyes never left her, his pride unspoken but written across every glance. Later, an insider revealed his private words. "She turned steel into silk. That's why she is the calm in our storms." The emir himself had cracked open in public view. The man who arrived as a calculating negotiator left the evening as something different, a man who had been touched by compassion. And for those present, it was clear. The balance of the night no longer belonged to politics. It belonged to Catherine. Yet there was something deeper happening, something that stirred memories from the past. Because in that hall, as the emir's voice carried with warmth, another spirit seemed to return. The one Catherine so often evokes, without even trying. A touch of Diana's spirit returns. There was a moment in the hall when time seemed to blur. As Catherine accepted the emir's words with humility, many could not help but think of Princess Diana. The Middle East had adored her, not just for her beauty, but for her unmatched compassion and humanity. She was the princess who embraced the forgotten, who carried empathy as her crown. And now, decades later, Catherine unknowingly brought that spirit back. Her gown with its subtle desert-inspired designs, her effortless Arabic greetings, her instinct to listen rather than dominate, all of it echoed the qualities that made Diana beloved across the world. One guest whispered quietly, "It felt as if Diana's light had returned through her." The emir himself had admired Diana in her time, remembering her visits and the way she connected with people beyond politics. And in Catherine, he saw that same rare gift, the ability to bridge worlds, not with force, but with kindness. This wasn't about flattery or spectacle. It was about recognition, about feeling the same energy he once experienced decades earlier. Observers later noted that the emir seemed almost captivated. his expressions unguarded, his tone softened in a way rarely seen in public. It was like he was speaking to a memory, one aide reflected. But the memory was alive again in front of him. William, ever the steady presence beside her, understood this better than anyone. He had seen his mother's spirit in moments before, but that night was different. That night, the world saw it too. His pride was clear, not in words but in the way he stood at her side, protective yet admiring, allowing Catherine's quiet storm to fill the room. By the end of the evening, it wasn't policy papers or signed deals that people carried with them. It was the unshakable sense that something bigger had happened. A bridge built, a wall broken, and a spirit reborn. Catherine had stepped into the role of empathy's heir, not by choice, but by nature. And for the emir, it was undeniable. He had come to Buckingham as a power broker. He left having glimpsed Diana's legacy shining through Catherine, a force no politics could rival. William's quiet strength beside her. All through the evening, Catherine was the center of gravity, but behind her stood William, steady as a shadow and strong as a shield. He didn't need to command attention or dominate the room. His presence was quiet, yet deeply felt, a form of strength that anchored everything Catherine did. When she spoke, William's eyes followed her with admiration. Every nod, every glance, every smile from him was a silent declaration. He trusted her. He believed in her. He was proud of her. Those in the hall noticed it. He looked at her as if she was already his queen, one guest said afterward, describing the unspoken bond between them. William's role that night was not to negotiate or challenge the emir. It was to stand as Catherine's protector, allowing her light to shine fully without interruption. In moments where her words carried delicate weight, his subtle gestures of reassurance gave her the confidence to keep going. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Insiders later revealed that William privately called her the crown's calm in chaos. And it was true. She had turned a tense evening into one of warmth and unity, but she did not do it alone. William's quiet strength beside her allowed her to move with freedom, knowing she was supported at every step. The symbolism was not lost on those present. This was not a monarchy divided or outdated, but a monarchy united, a partnership between two people who understood their roles and each other perfectly. Catherine carried the empathy, William carried the shield. Together, they represented a new kind of leadership, one rooted in humanity and shared purpose. Even King Charles, who had entered the banquet with cautious anticipation, was said to be visibly reassured watching them. The monarchy's future was right before his eyes, not just in bloodline, but in character. By the end of the night, whispers spread through the hall. This is what modern royalty looks like. William and Catherine weren't simply heirs. They were a team, one that showed the world how unity and emotional intelligence could disarm even the hardest of negotiators. And as the emir softened further, one thing became clear. Catherine's power was undeniable, but it was magnified by William's steady presence beside her, which leads directly into the heart of the matter. Catherine's hidden influence, her soft power that carried no titles or signatures, yet shifted the balance of the entire evening. Diplomacy without words. Catherine's hidden power. Catherine held no official role that night. She wasn't expected to lead discussions or negotiate treaties. Yet, it was her presence that changed the course of the banquet. Her influence wasn't on documents, but on hearts, and that was what made it unstoppable. Throughout the evening, she touched nothing of policy, no contracts, no proposals. But she touched something deeper, the human side of diplomacy. She listened, she smiled, she leaned into conversations not as a royal figure, but as a woman of empathy. And the emir responded in a way no advisor could have predicted. Palace aides later admitted the shift was astonishing. Proposals once considered too harsh or one-sided suddenly opened for mutual review. Demands that had seemed set in stone began to soften. The emir himself, once described as unyielding, was now engaged in dialogue that carried warmth instead of pressure. Foreign officials present that night gave her a name: soft power at its purest. Catherine had shown that diplomacy doesn't always require speeches or strategies. Sometimes it requires humanity. Her instinctive gestures, the touch of a hand, the warmth of a smile, the steadiness in her gaze, had rewritten the atmosphere of the room. Even those outside the royal circle acknowledged her influence. One Middle Eastern envoy said bluntly, "She was the most effective diplomat in the room, and she didn't even try." By the time the evening closed, it was undeniable. The emir, who had come with rigid demands, was leaving with softened terms and heartfelt praise for a woman who never once mentioned politics. Catherine had proven that true power isn't always in the crown or the throne. Sometimes it is in character, in the ability to connect beyond status and structure. And as the palace doors closed behind the emir that night, aides understood what they had witnessed. Catherine had reshaped an entire negotiation with no speeches, no titles, no official duties. Only empathy, only grace. It was diplomacy without words, and it was her greatest hidden power. A historic pivot, hidden in a smile. The banquet had been planned for months. Advisors drafted strategy papers, rehearsed speeches, and braced for confrontation. Yet in the end, the turning point came not from policy, but from Catherine's smile. That simple act, warm, unforced, genuine, shifted the energy of the night more than any document could. Palace insiders later called it an unplanned masterclass in emotional statecraft. The emir, who had arrived with iron demands, was now leaning into conversations, his tone softened, his stance transformed. The most complex negotiations had melted into dialogue, not battle. King Charles himself took notice. Privately, he praised Catherine for reminding him of his mother's quiet command, a form of power that didn't need force to be effective. He admitted to aides, "She carries the same calm strength my mother once did." Even Queen Camilla, often more reserved in her observations, was said to have expressed deep respect. That in itself was remarkable. Catherine had moved not only a foreign leader, but her own royal circle. The true impact was felt behind closed doors. Policies that had seemed immovable suddenly became flexible. Demands once labeled impossible were quietly set aside. The emir's delegation, who had entered the palace with sharp instructions, found themselves echoing his softened tone. For the advisors who had spent sleepless nights preparing for battle, it was almost surreal. And yet, it was undeniable. Catherine had turned the course of the evening with no speeches, no declarations, just presence and humanity. A senior diplomat described it best. What Catherine did that night can't be written in treaties. It was the art of making people feel seen. That was the true pivot, not just for the evening, but for the monarchy itself. The world saw a future queen who understood power differently, not as something demanded, but as something earned through empathy. What happened next confirmed it. The emir himself, once the hardest man in the room, left Buckingham not with the cold grip of contracts, but with words of rare praise for the woman who had changed everything. And so, a banquet remembered for glitter and grandeur became something greater. The night diplomacy bowed to compassion. The heart that silenced a kingdom. The following morning, Buckingham Palace was unusually quiet. The emir of Qatar had departed, but his farewell left a mark no one expected. He didn't boast of deals or victories. Instead, he spoke of Catherine, her grace, her humility, and the way one gesture had altered the entire night. She reminded me, he told officials, that true strength is not in demands, but in dignity. At Windsor, William returned to his children with the story. George and Charlotte listened wide-eyed as he shared how their mother had changed the course of an evening, not with politics, but with what he called Mama's magic. It was the kind of story they would carry with them, a lesson that leadership isn't about titles, but about heart. Behind palace walls, the significance grew clearer. Catherine had achieved what policy alone could not. She had softened a titan, reminded the monarchy of its greatest strength, and written a chapter that would be remembered not for its contracts, but for its humanity. Even aides hardened by years of negotiations admitted the truth. She didn't just influence the night, she owned it. The emir's visit would go down in history, not for the hard bargaining that was expected, but for the way one woman turned steel into silk, with nothing more than compassion. Catherine had shown that true power lies in the ability to move people, not just systems. As the world reflected on the banquet, one truth stood tall. The emir lost his heart that night, and the world watched it happen. And with it, Catherine's quiet legacy deepened. She wasn't just the Princess of Wales anymore. She had become the crowned soul, the woman whose strength lay not in power, but in the power of empathy. The emir came for politics, but left with a heart changed forever. Catherine's grace silenced the hardest man in the room, proving compassion can outweigh power. That night, he didn't win treaties, he lost his heart. And the world saw the Princess of Wales become the crown's quiet soul.